Have you ever wondered what truly defines stupidity in men? Carl Jung, one of history's greatest psychologists, identified behavioral patterns that reveal the true face of ignorance in men who often don't recognize their own signs of stupidity. These signs are like invisible traps that destroy relationships, careers, and entire lives. What makes a man truly stupid isn't his intelligence, but how he navigates both his inner and outer worlds. And the most frightening part, any of us could fall into these traps without realizing it. Discover now the 7 critical signs Jung detected and how they might be present in your life or in the lives of men around you. Sign 1. Reacts before thinking. In the depths of human psychology, Carl Jung identified a critical distinction between the wise and the foolish. The stupid man, according to Jungian perspective, consistently demonstrates a dangerous tendency. He reacts before thinking. This impulsive behavior isn't merely a personality quirk, but a fundamental flaw in psychological development that creates ripples of destruction throughout his life. When faced with challenges, criticism, or unexpected situations, the unwise man immediately launches into action or emotion without the crucial intermediary step of reflection. His nervous system goes from stimulus to response with no pause for contemplation. Jung recognized this pattern as evidence of an underdeveloped ego complex, where primitive reactions bypass the higher thinking functions that separate humans from our animal ancestors. This reactivity manifests in countless harmful ways. In conversations, the impulsive man interrupts before others finish speaking, already formulating responses rather than truly listening. In relationships, he explodes at perceived slights before understanding context. In business, he makes snap judgments based on emotional triggers rather than careful analysis. His world becomes a series of knee-jerk responses rather than thoughtful choices. Jung understood that this pattern often stems from an unconscious fear of vulnerability. By reacting instantly, the man avoids the discomfort of sitting with uncertainty or challenging emotions. The thoughtless reaction serves as a defense mechanism, protecting him from the deeper work of processing complex feelings or confronting uncomfortable truths about himself or his situation. The impulsive man frequently confuses reaction speed with intelligence. He believes his quick responses demonstrate mental sharpness, when in reality, they reveal an inability to navigate complexity. True intelligence in the Jungian framework involves the capacity to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, while resisting immediate judgment, precisely what the reactive man cannot achieve. Furthermore, this pattern creates a feedback loop of regret. The man who acts before thinking routinely finds himself apologizing for words spoken in haste or decisions made without proper consideration. Rather than learning from these experiences, he often blames external circumstances or others for making him react the way he did, further cementing his pattern of irresponsibility. Jung taught that the path to wisdom begins with creating space between stimulus and response. This psychological pause, what some might call mindfulness, allows the unconscious mind to communicate with the conscious mind, integrating intuition with rational thought. The stupid man has never developed this capacity, instead remaining trapped in perpetual reactivity. Breaking this pattern requires conscious effort and practice. By learning to recognize emotional triggers and deliberately pausing before responding, men can begin to develop the reflective capacity that Jung identified as essential to psychological maturity. This isn't about suppressing emotional responses, but rather about integrating them with rational thinking to produce wiser, more measured actions. The man who consistently reacts before thinking remains forever a child psychologically, regardless of his chronological age or professional achievements. His impulsivity prevents meaningful growth and sabotages his potential for deeper connections with others and himself. Jung would suggest that true adulthood begins when we learn to respond rather than react, a distinction that fundamentally separates wisdom from stupidity. Sign 2 needs to be right all the time. The compulsive need to be right in every situation is what Jung recognized as a dangerous manifestation of an unhealthy ego. The stupid man in Jungian psychology demonstrates this trait consistently. He cannot tolerate being wrong, even when evidence clearly contradicts his position. This isn't merely stubbornness, it represents a profound psychological wound that Jung believed stemmed from deep-seated insecurity. When confronted with opposing viewpoints, this man doesn't engage with curiosity, but with defensiveness. His identity has become so entwined with his opinions that any challenge feels like an existential threat. Jung observed that this rigidity of thought reveals a fragile self-concept. The man who must always be right paradoxically reveals how uncertain he truly is about his own worth and capabilities. In conversations, this manifests as an inability to listen authentically. While others speak, he's not absorbing their perspective but formulating counter-arguments. He interrupts frequently, speaks over others, and dismisses contradicting evidence without consideration. The stupid man's argumentative nature isn't driven by a genuine pursuit of truth, but by the desperate need to protect his ego from perceived attacks. Jung noted that this behavior creates a psychological prison. By refusing to acknowledge when he's wrong, the man cuts himself off from one of life's most powerful growth mechanisms, learning from mistakes. His intellectual development stagnates as he rejects new information that might challenge his existing beliefs. This cognitive inflexibility represents what Jung would call an arrested development of consciousness. Relationships suffer tremendously under this pattern. Partners, friends, and colleagues eventually stop sharing honest thoughts, knowing any disagreement will trigger a defensive battle. The man's social world gradually shrinks to those who validate his perspectives or remain silent about their differences. This echo chamber further reinforces his delusion of intellectual infallibility. Professionally, this trait creates blind spots that can lead to catastrophic decision-making. When subordinates fear contradicting the boss, who must always be right, organizations lose valuable corrective feedback. Jung would recognize this as the shadow side of leadership. The refusal to integrate contrary perspectives inevitably leads to imbalanced decisions. What makes this pattern particularly insidious is how it masquerades as confidence or conviction. Society often rewards the appearance of certainty, mistaking inflexible opinions for strength of character. Jung warned against this confusion, noting that true psychological strength comes from the capacity to hold provisional truths that evolve with new information. The path to growth, according to Jungian thought, requires embracing intellectual humility. The wise man understands that being wrong isn't shameful, but instructive. He welcomes correction as an opportunity for expansion rather than a diminishment of status. This requires developing a secure sense of self-worth that isn't contingent upon being right in every instance. Breaking free from this pattern means cultivating what Jung called the tension of opposites, the ability to hold contradictory ideas simultaneously while working toward greater synthesis. It means recognizing that wisdom often emerges from acknowledging the limits of one's own understanding and remaining open to continuous learning through life's journey. Sign 3 ignores his own mistakes. The capacity to acknowledge and learn from one's missteps stands as a cornerstone of psychological maturity in Jung's framework. The stupid man, however, demonstrates a persistent blindness to his own errors, a defensive pattern that Jung identified as profoundly detrimental to individuation. This isn't occasional forgetfulness or oversight. It's a systematic refusal to confront personal failings that becomes a major obstacle to psychological development. This pattern manifests as a selective amnesia toward personal shortcomings while maintaining hyper-awareness of others' failures. When projects collapse under his leadership, relationships deteriorate through his actions, or personal goals remain chronically unachieved, the stupid man creates elaborate narratives that place responsibility elsewhere. Jung recognized this as the shadow at work, the disowned aspects of self being projected outward rather than integrated into consciousness. The psychological mechanism underlying this behavior involves what Jung termed inflation, an over-identification with the ego that cannot tolerate the humbling recognition of imperfection. The stupid man has unconsciously equated making mistakes with being fundamentally flawed as a person. This false equation creates an unbearable psychological tension that he resolves through denial rather than honest self-assessment. In professional contexts, this man becomes impervious to feedback. Performance reviews are dismissed as biased. Client complaints are attributed to unreasonable expectations, and missed deadlines are blamed on external factors. The learning cycle that powers professional growth, try, fail, analyze, adjust, becomes impossible when failure cannot be acknowledged. His career eventually plateaus or declines as his skills stagnate, while others continue evolving. Relationships suffer a similar fate under this pattern. Without the ability to recognize his contributions to conflicts, genuine reconciliation becomes impossible. Apologies, when offered at all, come with qualifications that effectively negate their sincerity. "I'm sorry if you felt hurt," rather than "I'm sorry for what I did." Jung would identify this as a failure of the anima, the unconscious feminine aspect that enables emotional honesty and vulnerability. What makes this pattern particularly destructive is its self-reinforcing nature. Each ignored mistake becomes precedent for dismissing the next, creating an increasingly distorted self-image that diverges further from reality. The gap between how the man perceives himself and how others experience him widens until he exists in what Jung might call a personal mythology disconnected from truth. The spiritual dimension of this failing concerned Jung deeply. He believed that confronting one's shadows, including mistakes and failings, was essential to psychological and spiritual growth. The man who cannot see his errors remains trapped in a stunted state of development, unable to achieve what Jung called the gold in the shadow, the wisdom and strength that come from integrating disowned aspects of self. Breaking this pattern requires developing what Jung would call active imagination, the capacity to honestly review one's actions without the distorting lens of ego protection. It means cultivating inner witnesses who can observe behavior objectively rather than defensively. This psychological skill doesn't emerge spontaneously, but requires deliberate practice and often the mirror provided by therapy or honest relationships. The alternative path, continuing to ignore mistakes, leads to a life of perpetual repetition. The stupid man encounters the same problems repeatedly, wondering why the world conspires against him, never recognizing that he carries the common denominator within himself. Jung would see this as tragic, a life unlived in its fullest potential because the man refuses the self-knowledge that comes from acknowledging his own imperfections. Sign 4. Confuses pride with courage. In Jung's psychological framework, distinguishing between authentic courage and inflated pride represents a critical developmental challenge. The stupid man consistently fails this test by mistaking his fragile ego's defensiveness for genuine bravery. This confusion isn't merely semantic, it reveals a profound misunderstanding of what true courage entails and prevents him from achieving authentic psychological strength. Genuine courage, as Jung understood it, involves confronting one's inner fears and shadows with honesty and vulnerability. It means facing uncomfortable truths about oneself and taking necessary risks for growth, despite fear. The stupid man, however, displays a counterfeit version, a brittle pride that masquerades as courage while actually serving as its obstacle. This man refuses to apologize because he believes it shows weakness. He doesn't back down from pointless confrontations because he fears appearing soft. He maintains harmful positions long after evidence has discredited them because he confuses stubbornness with conviction. Jung would recognize these behaviors as symptoms of an undeveloped personality structure where ego preservation takes precedence over psychological truth. The confusion manifests most clearly in how the stupid man handles vulnerability. True courage embraces vulnerability as essential to human connection and growth. The man who confuses pride with courage, however, treats vulnerability as enemy territory. He builds elaborate defenses against appearing uncertain, wrong, or emotionally affected by others. These defensive structures consume enormous psychological energy while cutting him off from authentic relationships and self-knowledge. In professional settings, this manifests as an inability to ask questions or seek help when needed. Rather than admitting knowledge gaps, he bluffs and postures, creating cascading problems as projects build upon faulty foundations. His teammates learn not to trust his assessments, as they recognize his reports reflect ego preservation rather than objective reality. Jung would identify this as the persona, social mask, overtaking authentic being. Relationships become battlegrounds where being right supersedes being connected. The stupid man cannot distinguish between attacks on his ideas and attacks on his worth as a person. What might be healthy disagreement becomes, through his distorted lens, an existential threat requiring disproportionate defensive responses. Partners, friends, and colleagues eventually exhaust themselves navigating his fragile pride, leaving him increasingly isolated. Jung noted that this pattern often stems from childhood wounds around inadequacy or shame. The boy who was punished for showing weakness or ridiculed for mistakes develops a compensatory pride structure that calcifies into adulthood. What began as an adaptive response becomes maladaptive rigidity, the psychological equivalent of permanent armor that prevents both injury and growth. Breaking this pattern requires what Jung called ego death, the painful but necessary process of separating identity from rigid self-concepts. The man must learn that he is not diminished by acknowledging mistakes, expressing uncertainty, or showing emotion. This transition often feels like a kind of psychological surrender, but actually represents liberation from the exhausting performance of false strength. The wise man, in contrast, understands the paradox that genuine courage often appears as softness to those confused by pride. He knows when to stand firm based on principle and when to yield based on new understanding. He recognizes that strength emerges from integration of all aspects of self, including vulnerability and uncertainty, rather than from rigid self-protection. Jung would see this as essential to individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole. Sign 5. Despises silence and reflection. The relationship with silence reveals profound truths about psychological development. Jung observed that the stupid man demonstrates a consistent pattern of aversion to quietude and introspection. This isn't simply a preference for activity, but represents a fundamental inability to tolerate the psychological space where true wisdom germinates. The stupid man fills every moment with noise, whether external through constant talking or internal through incessant distraction. This aversion manifests most obviously in conversation. The reflective pause that allows for thoughtful response feels unbearable to him. He interrupts, talks over others, and rushes to fill silences with words that often add little value. Jung would recognize this as compensation behavior, an unconscious strategy to avoid confronting the contents of his own psyche that might emerge in stillness. Digital technology has provided unprecedented tools for avoiding silence. The stupid man's constant scrolling, channel flipping, or podcast playing serves the same psychological function as earlier generations' avoidance techniques. Jung might interpret this as modern manifestation of an ancient problem, the flight from self-awareness that prevents psychological integration and maturity. In professional contexts, this manifests as an inability to engage in deep work, requiring sustained concentration. The stupid man flits between tasks, checks notifications compulsively, and avoids the focused silence that produces quality thinking. His output tends toward the superficial, because depth requires a comfort with reflection. He hasn't developed. Jung would identify this as failure to engage the transcendent function, the psychological capacity that emerges from sustained attention to inner process. Relationships suffer similarly under this pattern. Intimate connections require comfortable silences where authentic presence can emerge beyond words. The man who cannot tolerate reflective spaces creates relationships characterized by surface-level engagement rather than deep knowing. His partners often report feeling talked at rather than genuinely seen, as his constant verbalization prevents the attunement that comes through quieter forms of connection. Jung understood that this aversion often stems from fear of what waits. In silence, the unexamined life contains unprocessed trauma, unacknowledged shadows, and uncomfortable questions about meaning and purpose. By keeping constant noise, the stupid man protects himself from these challenging psychological contents, but also prevents the integration process necessary for wholeness. This pattern creates a spiritual poverty Jung would immediately recognize. Across wisdom traditions, silence has been understood as the fertile ground where deeper awareness grows. The man who cannot tolerate silence cuts himself off from this dimension of experience. His spiritual life, if it exists at all, remains intellectual abstraction rather than lived reality, because he avoids the quiet spaces where genuine spiritual experience often emerges. Breaking this pattern requires deliberate practice with progressively longer periods of undistracted silence. The initial discomfort, racing thoughts, emotional upheaval, or existential anxiety represents precisely what the stupid man has been avoiding. Working through this discomfort, rather than fleeing from it, marks the beginning of psychological maturation that Jung identified as essential to individuation. The alternative path, continuing to flee from silence, leads to increasing psychological fragmentation. Without reflective space, experiences remain unintegrated, wisdom fails to develop, and the man lives reactively rather than intentionally. Jung would see this as tragic, a life lived entirely at the surface, never reaching the depths where authentic selfhood emerges through thoughtful engagement with one's inner world. Sign 6. Flees from everything that contradicts. The capacity to engage productively with opposing viewpoints represents a hallmark of psychological maturity. Jung observed that the stupid man demonstrates a consistent pattern of avoidance, when faced with information, perspectives, or experiences that challenge his existing beliefs. This isn't simply preference for comfortable ideas, but represents a fundamental developmental arrest that prevents growth and integration of the psyche. This avoidance manifests in multiple domains. In intellectual life, the stupid man creates echo chambers where his views receive constant reinforcement. He carefully curates news sources, social circles, and information streams to filter out contradicting perspectives. Jung would recognize this as a defense mechanism protecting a fragile ego structure that cannot tolerate the discomfort of cognitive dissonance. When unavoidably confronted with challenging information, his response reveals the psychological immaturity underlying this pattern. Rather than engaging with the substance of contradicting views, he attacks their sources, questions motivations, or employs logical fallacies to dismiss them without genuine consideration. Jung would identify this as shadow projection, attributing malice or stupidity to others rather than examining his own resistance. In relationships, this manifests as an inability to genuinely hear criticism or feedback. The stupid man surrounds himself with sycophants or intimidates others into silence. When partners, friends, or colleagues muster the courage to offer contradicting perspectives, he responds with defensiveness, anger, or complete withdrawal. Relationships consequently remain shallow, as authentic connection requires the ability to navigate differences honestly. Professional growth stagnates under this pattern. The stupid man cannot benefit from mentorship, constructive criticism, or exposure to alternative methodologies. His skills plateau early as he rejects input that might expand his capabilities. Jung would see this as failure of the transcendent function, the psychological capacity that integrates opposing perspectives into higher synthesis and enables ongoing development. What makes this pattern particularly destructive is how it creates intellectual and experiential impoverishment while fostering the illusion of certainty. The stupid man believes his perspectives are superior precisely because he has systematically eliminated exposure to alternatives. This creates a feedback loop of increasing narrowness and rigidity that Jung would recognize as antithetical to the individuation process. The psychological origins of this pattern often trace to early experiences where contradiction triggered shame or rejection. The boy whose natural questioning was punished develops adaptive strategies to avoid similar pain in adulthood. What began as self-protection calcifies into rigid avoidance that ultimately prevents psychological growth and authentic connection. Breaking this pattern requires developing what Jung would call psychological courage, the capacity to tolerate the discomfort that accompanies cognitive dissonance. It means recognizing that growth often emerges precisely from the tension between opposing ideas or experiences. This developmental step involves strengthening the ego structure to withstand contradiction without perceiving it as existential threat. The wise man, by contrast, deliberately seeks exposure to contradicting perspectives. He recognizes them as essential to refining his understanding and developing psychological complexity. Jung might describe this as conscious engagement with the opposites, the willingness to hold paradox and contradiction as generative tensions, rather than threats to be avoided. Sign 7 seeks validation from those he doesn't respect. One of Jung's most penetrating insights concerns the relationship between external validation and psychological integrity. The stupid man demonstrates a paradoxical pattern where he seeks approval, confirmation, and acknowledgement from people he privately disdains or dismisses. This isn't merely inconsistency, but reveals a profound internal fragmentation that Jung would identify as obstacle to authentic selfhood. This pattern manifests most clearly in social relationships. The stupid man courts approval from those whose character, intelligence, or achievements he secretly criticizes. He laughs at jokes he finds juvenile, affirms opinions he considers simplistic, and adapts his personality to win favor from those he wouldn't respect enough to emulate. Jung would recognize this as compensation for internal insecurity. External validation becomes substitute for absent self-worth. Professional environments often amplify this tendency. The stupid man flatters superiors he considers incompetent, seeks recognition from colleagues whose work he derides, and pursues status within systems he claims to reject. This creates psychological dissonance Jung might identify as spiritual corruption, the progressive erosion of integrity that occurs when external validation supersedes internal values. Social media has provided unprecedented opportunities for this pattern to flourish. The stupid man obsessively tracks metrics from anonymous masses whose individual judgment he would dismiss in person. He crafts personas designed to appeal to audiences he privately considers beneath him. Jung would see this as inflation of the persona, the social mask growing so dominant that it suffocates authentic selfhood. What makes this pattern particularly destructive is how it corrodes self-respect. The man who consistently seeks validation from those he doesn't respect unconsciously acknowledges that his own judgment lacks authority, even to himself. This creates a feedback loop where diminishing self-trust increases dependence on external validation, regardless of its source. The psychological origins often traced to developmental failures in self-valuation. The boy who received inconsistent or conditional love develops adaptive strategies where external approval becomes necessary substitute for self-approval. What began as survival mechanism becomes habitual orientation that prevents psychological maturation. Relationships suffer profoundly under this pattern. The stupid man attracts and is attracted to those who provide validation without demanding authentic engagement. These connections remain superficial by design. Depth would require vulnerability and judgment that might jeopardize the supply of affirmation. Partners eventually sense the underlying contempt, creating cycles of conflict or withdrawal. Breaking this pattern requires painful honesty about the gap between stated values and validation-seeking behaviors. It means developing what Jung would call inner authority, the capacity to evaluate oneself according to personal standards rather than external metrics. This developmental step involves strengthening connection to one's own discernment while reducing dependence on others' approval. The wise man, by contrast, seeks counsel and feedback primarily from those he genuinely respects. He values their perspective precisely because their judgment, character, or expertise commands his authentic admiration. Jung might describe this as psychological congruence, alignment between one's values and one's relationships that enables authentic growth rather than fragmented performance. The man who learns to seek validation only from those he genuinely respects moves toward what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole through progressive integration of conscious and unconscious aspects of personality.